Samantha Holt was a seasoned detective, respected for her integrity and her ability to navigate the gritty underworld of crime. For 21 years, she had served in the Chicago Police Department with distinction. But all of that came crashing down one Thursday morning. At 10:42 a.m., 4 uniformed officers stormed into her office. Samantha hadn't expected this, but she knew something was coming. They didn't even give her a chance to get up from her desk before Officer Derek Carter, one of the men she had once mentored, spoke the words that shook her to the core. "Samantha Holt, you're under arrest for evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority." The words hit her like a slap in the face, but Samantha didn't flinch. She'd seen these types of tactics before, aggressive moves meant to silence the truth. She'd never been one to shout, but she could feel the eyes of everyone around her as the officers placed her hands behind her back. No warrant, no explanation. It was all for show. They dragged her through the precinct like she was a criminal. The sound of her badge, still clipped to her hip, echoed in her ears as they paraded her through the hallways. Her gun was still holstered. It felt surreal. The sergeant at the front desk, who Samantha had once trained, turned away without so much as a glance. Everyone was silent, but they knew. They had heard the rumors, the whispers about her alleged corruption. Samantha kept her chin up, walking with the composure she had always maintained in the face of adversity. Outside, reporters waited like vultures, cameras flashing and questions shouted at her. "Did you steal narcotics from the evidence room? Are you cooperating with the investigation?" they asked, their voices cutting through the air like knives. She didn't respond. There was no point. The arrest wasn't about justice. It was a message to anyone who dared question the system. Derek Carter slid into the back of the squad car beside her. It wasn't protocol, but it didn't matter anymore. He leaned in close enough for her to smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You should have kept your nose out of things, Samantha," he whispered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Now look at you." Samantha didn't flinch. She had seen this before. People thinking they could break her. But she was never afraid of the darkness. She knew it better than they ever could. "I've never been scared of the dark," she said quietly. "I just know it better than you do." She didn't need to say more. Carter didn't respond, but the twitch in his jaw said enough. By the time they arrived at the precinct, she had already resigned herself to the fact that this wasn't about finding the truth. It was about silencing her. Samantha was fingerprinted, photographed, and locked in a holding cell for 6 hours. Her lawyer, Jason Phillips, wasn't allowed in until 4 hours had passed. It wasn't an accident. They wanted the press to have time to spin their story, to make sure the public would see her as guilty long before she could mount any defense. By the time Phillips arrived, Samantha had already become the headline. "The file's sealed," Jason said, dropping into the chair across from her. "But it stinks, Sam. This isn't just about you. It's coming from the top of the department." Samantha exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling in. She had suspected something for a while. Cases going missing, evidence tampered with, files mysteriously reclassified. Every time she raised the issue, she was told she was being paranoid. But now it was clear. They had decided she was a threat, and they weren't going to let her investigate any longer. Jason's voice cut through her thoughts. "It's Carter, and a few others. This is a coordinated hit. They're covering something up." Samantha stared at the wall. She wasn't angry. She wasn't panicked. She was just, quiet. She had known this was coming. If they thought she would go down without a fight, they were wrong. "There are victims out there," Samantha said softly. "People whose cases were buried, whose rights were ignored, all to protect the wrong people. If I'm going down, I'm not going down alone." The hours dragged on. By the time Samantha was released, no formal charges had been filed. No explanation, no apology. Just a file marked pending review and a precinct full of officers who treated her like she was already guilty. She didn't say a word as she walked out of the precinct, but as soon as she stepped into the parking lot, she made one call. Not to her family, not to the press, to the mayor. "It's time we had that conversation," Samantha said, her voice steady. "And I want everything on the table." For the next week, Samantha disappeared from the public eye. No calls, no texts, no sightings. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. For those who had orchestrated her downfall, it was the good news they had hoped for. They believed the battle was won, and they could return to their normal, unchecked activities. But while they relaxed, thinking they had silenced her for good, Samantha was not idle. In fact, she was already building her case, quietly and methodically. She had taken up residence in a small rental in the quiet town of Oakwood, under a different name, far from the prying eyes of the city. She had no intention of hiding forever. She was simply biding her time. In the meantime, she worked on gathering the evidence she needed to take down the corruption that had run rampant in the Chicago Police Department. A tech firm she had helped in the past owed her a favor, and they had built her a secure database to cross-reference internal affairs records. What Samantha found was staggering. The more she dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about her. This was about a system designed to protect its own, no matter the cost. Certain officers like Derek Carter, Officer Ryan West, Lieutenant Thomas Bennett, and even Captain David Reyes had been involved in a massive web of misconduct. Evidence had gone missing, cases had been altered, and victims had been silenced. The number of reports she found that had been buried, misclassified, or simply erased altogether was more than she could have imagined. It wasn't just corruption, it was a systematic cover-up. She printed every name, every date, every complaint. She circled the ones that overlapped. There were 27 officers whose names had appeared multiple times across different incidents, and she knew that if she was going to take them down, she would need to be strategic. This wasn't just about her reinstating her position. It was about taking down an entire network of predators within the department. The data was clear. Carter, West, Bennett, and Reyes had systematically used their power to cover up their mistakes, protect their interests, and manipulate the system to their advantage. Missing evidence, false statements, witness intimidation, everything she had suspected was true. This was not an isolated incident. This was a pattern that had been in place for years. But Samantha wasn't just going to walk back into the department and start making arrests. She knew the dangers of rushing into something like this. She needed allies, and one of the few people who had stood by her before was Detective Rachel Turner, a rising star in the department who had worked under Samantha for years. Rachel was the kind of cop who believed in justice. And although she had kept her head down in the wake of Samantha's arrest, deep down, she knew something wasn't right. One evening, Rachel sent Samantha a message. "I believe you. I don't think you're crazy. Let's meet." Samantha knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. She replied with a simple location, a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, far from the eyes of anyone who might still be watching. They met the next morning, and Rachel confirmed what Samantha had already suspected. She too had noticed strange inconsistencies, cases that didn't add up, reports that didn't seem to fit the timeline, and officers who were too eager to sweep things under the rug. "I'm in," Rachel said, her voice steady. "We can't let them get away with this." With Rachel on her side, Samantha knew it was time to act. She contacted Mayor Lily Adams, who had been a friend and ally during Samantha's years on the force. The mayor, a strong advocate for justice, had been kept in the dark about much of the internal corruption. But when Samantha presented the evidence she had gathered, the mayor agreed to back her, quietly behind the scenes. The plan was to bring in federal oversight. Within days, a federal liaison was assigned to the case, and Samantha was reinstated as the head of internal affairs, this time with a temporary federal mandate to oversee officer conduct in the department. It was an unexpected turn, but one that sent shockwaves through the precinct. Her former colleagues, who had believed they had seen the last of her, were stunned when she walked back through the precinct doors, her badge gleaming on her chest. The department, which had once felt like her home, now felt like a battlefield. The officers who had been complicit in the corruption no longer had the luxury of hiding in the shadows. They knew Samantha was back, and she wasn't there to make peace. When she entered the precinct, the atmosphere shifted. No more casual banter, no more jokes. The building seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with tension. Samantha didn't need to speak loudly. Her presence was enough. Her first order of business was simple. "I'm here to review every internal complaint, every audit, and every report tied to this department," she said, her voice steady, but with an unmistakable edge. "Everyone's paperwork better be in order." And with that, the investigation began in earnest. But Samantha knew that while she had the power to make them sweat, the real battle was just beginning. As soon as Samantha returned to the department, the shift in the air was palpable. Officers whispered in corners, phones were wiped clean, and the usual banter that filled the break rooms was replaced with an uneasy silence. No one laughed, no one joked. They all knew she was there for one reason: to make them accountable for their actions. And the more she dug, the tighter the noose would become. Samantha wasted no time. She posted a list on the precinct bulletin board detailing the mandatory internal interviews she would be conducting. The list was short but carefully selected. Officer Ryan West, Detective Chris Lawson, Lieutenant Thomas Bennett, and Captain David Reyes. Each name sent ripples through the department. These were the men who had been at the heart of the corruption, who had used their positions of power to cover their tracks. The interviews would begin the following week. In the meantime, Samantha's office was a hive of activity. She spent hours poring over files, cross-referencing reports, and pulling up old case files. Rachel Turner, who had become an invaluable ally, worked late into the night with her, gathering more evidence. It wasn't long before they uncovered a disturbing pattern. Each of the officers in question had been involved in multiple cases of misconduct, ranging from missing evidence to falsifying reports and witness intimidation. The deeper they went, the more interconnected the web of corruption became. Samantha knew they had to be careful. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. The department was watching her every move, and one wrong step could be the end of everything she had worked for. She had to tread carefully, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of the victims whose cases had been buried and forgotten. The first interview was with Officer Ryan West, a quiet, nervous man who had always been a bit of an outsider. Samantha had never trusted him, and now she was certain he had a lot to hide. He entered her office at exactly 9 a.m., his eyes darting nervously around the room. Samantha didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Let's talk about March 14th, 3 years ago," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The case involving the missing narcotics. Your report doesn't match the evidence log. Can you explain that?" West's face turned pale. He fumbled for an answer but quickly stammered, I don't know what happened. I didn't touch the evidence. I didn't even write that report. It wasn't me." Samantha leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Then who wrote it, Ryan? Who covered up the missing drugs?" West looked down at his hands, the guilt clear in his eyes. He wasn't ready to confess yet, but the cracks were beginning to show. Samantha could see it. She knew it was just a matter of time before he broke. "I'll come back to you later," she said, her voice softening just enough to let him know she wasn't finished with him yet. The next interview was with Detective Chris Lawson, a man who had always appeared to be the picture of professionalism, but Samantha had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. Lawson was seated across from her, his hands folded tightly in front of him. She wasted no time. "Your involvement in the Langston case," Samantha began, her voice measured. "The witness testimony was compromised. Why?" Lawson didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as though he had anticipated the question. "I don't know what you're talking about, Samantha," he said coolly. "Everything in that case was handled by the book." Samantha's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Because I've got witness statements that say otherwise. You tried to intimidate the witness into changing their story. You think I don't know that?" For a brief moment, Lawson's composure cracked. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to her, but he didn't say a word. Samantha knew he was calculating his next move. The interviews continued, each one revealing a little more of the corruption that had infected the department. But Samantha wasn't just looking for answers. She was building a case, slowly, methodically. She knew the truth would come out, and when it did, the men behind the corruption would have nowhere to hide. By the end of the week, Samantha had gathered enough evidence to know that she was on the right track. But the pressure was mounting. Her every move was being watched, and the men she was investigating were getting nervous. Some of them were already starting to make mistakes. Captain David Reyes, one of the men at the top of the corruption chain, had always been a master of maintaining his power. But as the interviews progressed, Samantha could see the walls beginning to close in on him. He had underestimated her, and now she was ready to take him down. The walls in the precinct had started to close in. Every day, Samantha could feel the tension building. The officers she had once worked with, the ones she had trusted, were beginning to show cracks in their carefully constructed facades. Captain David Reyes had started making small, almost imperceptible mistakes. Missing meetings, misfiling reports, and his once commanding presence had turned into something desperate. Samantha knew he was feeling the heat, and it was only a matter of time before he cracked. Her investigation had taken a sharp turn. The more she dug, the clearer it became that Reyes wasn't just a participant in the corruption, he had been orchestrating it all along. His fingerprints were all over every shady deal, every manipulated case. She had the evidence now, every document, every witness, every recorded conversation. The only thing left was to confront him. The federal liaison assigned to oversee the case had been giving her subtle nods of approval, but Samantha knew she couldn't rely on them entirely. This battle was hers to fight, and she was ready for it. The day after her latest round of interview, Samantha sat in her office, reviewing the files one last time. Rachel Turner walked in, her face unreadable. Samantha didn't need to ask. She already knew what had happened. "We've got him," Rachel said, dropping a thick file onto the desk. "Reyes, it's all here." Samantha opened the file, quickly scanning the documents. It was everything she needed. Case files showing Reyes' involvement in suppressing evidence, falsified reports he'd signed off on, and witness statements corroborating the claims. She had enough to take him down, but she had to be careful. Reyes wouldn't go down without a fight, and she couldn't afford to underestimate him. "Tomorrow," Samantha said, her voice cold. "I'm going to bring him in." Rachel nodded. She knew what this meant. The precinct had been on edge for weeks, but now the final confrontation was inevitable. Samantha had spent too much time gathering evidence to back down now. There was no turning back. The next morning, Samantha arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. She parked her car in the back lot, keeping a low profile. As she walked through the back entrance, the building was eerily quiet. Officers still avoided eye contact with her, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. They were all waiting for the storm to hit. At 9:30 a.m., Samantha entered the conference room. Reyes was already there, seated across the table from her. His face was set in a mask of calm, but Samantha could see the tension in his eyes. He knew what was coming. "Captain Reyes," she began, her voice steady but firm. "We need to talk about your involvement in the Langston case." Reyes didn't flinch, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his unease. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, trying to maintain control. "That case is closed." Samantha slid the file across the table toward him. "Not anymore," she said, her tone colder. "You've been involved in every aspect of this cover-up. The missing drugs, the altered reports, the witnesses you silenced. It all points back to you, and I've got the proof." Reyes stared at the file but didn't reach for it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his hands folded across his chest. He wasn't going to go down easily. Samantha could see that now. "You don't have the full picture, Samantha," Reyes said, his voice low. "You think you've uncovered everything? You've only scratched the surface." Samantha leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Then help me see the rest, Captain, because right now I've got you cornered. You've been running this department like your own personal empire, and it ends now." Reyes let out a deep sigh, the mask of calm slipping for a moment. "You're playing a dangerous game. You think the feds will protect you when this all comes out? You're not untouchable, Samantha. You never were." "I never needed to be," she replied, her voice unwavering. "What I needed was the truth, and I've got it." There was a long silence, and for a moment Samantha thought Reyes might try to make a move. Something desperate, some last-ditch attempt to save himself. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for the file and opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the documents. "I'm not the one who's going down, Samantha," he said quietly. "You are." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "You think I'm afraid of you?" "No," Reyes said, his lips curling into a faint, almost pitying smile. "I think you're too arrogant to see what's really happening here. You're in way over your head." But Samantha wasn't buying it. She had already anticipated every one of his moves, and she knew his game. Reyes was trying to play his last card, fear. He was hoping to intimidate her, to make her second-guess everything she had worked for. But Samantha didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that fear only had power if you let it. "I'm done with you, Reyes," she said, standing up. "You're finished." As she turned to leave, she could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look back. Reyes wasn't going to win. Not today. Not anymore. The precinct buzzed with a nervous energy as the news of Rhea's confrontation with Samantha spread through the building like wildfire. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire system that had enabled corruption to flourish for years. Samantha knew it wasn't enough to simply take down Reyes. She had to ensure that everyone who had been complicit in the cover-up faced consequences. And for that, she needed to move fast. Over the next 48 hours, Samantha's team, led by Detective Rachel Turner, worked tirelessly. They coordinated with the federal liaison and started pulling every thread they could find. They had the evidence, they had the witnesses, and now they had the momentum. The arrests were inevitable. The following morning, Samantha stood in front of the entire department for an emergency meeting. Captain Reyes had been removed from his post, but there were still many who had been involved in the scheme. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she held her ground. I hope you all understand that this isn't just about one man. This is about a system of corruption that's been allowed to fester in this department for far too long, Samantha began, her voice carrying through the room. This is about doing what's right, not what's easy. And if you've broken the law, if you've taken advantage of your badge, you'll face the consequences. No one is above accountability. Her words were met with silence, but Samantha could see the fear in the eyes of the officers in the room. Some of them had known about the corruption, but had stayed silent, complicit in their own way. Some had turned a blind eye to what was happening, not wanting to get involved. But now they all understood. This was no longer a game. It was over. Within hours, Officer Ryan West, Detective Chris Lawson, Lieutenant Thomas Bennett, and a handful of other officers were taken into custody. The federal agents moved swiftly, arresting them one by one as the news cameras swarmed outside. The public reaction was swift, outrage mixed with a sense of vindication. The story dominated the news cycle for days, and the city's faith in the police department was shattered. But for Samantha, this wasn't about the media frenzy. It wasn't about the public praise. It was about justice. It was about those whose lives had been destroyed by the corruption, whose cases had been swept under the rug. It was about the victims who had no voice until now. 2 days after the arrests, Samantha stood in her office, looking at the empty desk where she had once sat, waiting for her next case. Everything had changed. The department had been rocked to its core, but she knew the hard work was far from over. There would be more to uncover, more to investigate. The fight for accountability didn't end with one victory. It had to be continuous. Rachel knocked on her door, interrupting her thoughts. She smiled faintly as she walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're not going to believe this," Rachel said, her voice full of excitement. "We've got more people flipping. There's a whole network we didn't even know about. But we're getting closer, Sam." Samantha smiled, taking the coffee from her. "I figured there was more. There always is." As she sat down at her desk, looking over the new files Rachel had brought in, Samantha knew this was only the beginning. The work was never really done. There would always be more cases, more corruption to root out. But for the first time in a long time, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. She wasn't just chasing justice for herself anymore. She was creating a future where truth mattered more than power. Later that afternoon, Samantha made one final stop. She stood outside the county jail, looking at the imposing building. She had seen it many times before, but this time, she wasn't the one behind bars. This time, she was there to ensure the truth would be heard. Inside, Officer Derek Carter sat in a holding cell, awaiting trial. His once smug demeanor had disappeared, replaced by a look of defeat. He had tried to play the game, to manipulate the system, but now he was just another cog in the machine of justice that Samantha had set in motion. Samantha walked up to the glass, her gaze unwavering as she met Carter's eyes. He didn't speak, but his expression said everything she needed to know. He had underestimated her. He had thought she would break, but she hadn't. She'd stood strong, and now it was his turn to face the consequences. "Do you know why I'm here, Derek?" Samantha asked, her voice calm but resolute. He didn't respond, but the bitterness in his eyes was enough. "I'm not here for you," Samantha said, tapping the file against the glass. "I'm here for the truth. You could have walked away. You could have chosen the right path. But instead, you chose to bury it all. You chose to lie." She paused, letting the silence hang between them. This is for every person you hurt, every victim you ignored, for the badge you abused. And with that, she turned and walked out, the doors clicking shut behind her. As she walked down the quiet hallway, Samantha didn't look back. She had done what needed to be done, and while the road ahead would be long, it would be worth every step. Justice had been restored, but the fight for integrity would never end.